Time now to take a look through the international newspapers. I'm joined by Elena. Hello, Elena. And we're going to start off with coverage of that row between the US and Russia over Syria.
Yes, the New York Times today points out that a meeting with Obama just 2.5 months ago, the then Russian President Medvedev said that US and Russia relations had never been so good at any point over the last decade. Now that Putin's back in power, of course, that looks pretty distant now, they say. It shows really that the Obama idea of resetting relations in Russia was never going to go very far because their common ground, their common interests really don't have that much in common. And now Putin seems to feel no impunity about cracking down on demonstrators in Russia and continuing to back Assad in Syria. And it shows really that the US has very little manoeuvring space, very little influence over what Putin does. He doesn't care, essentially, the New York Times is saying. That, of course, is really a gift to lots of Obama's opponents back home in the US who can say that he's carrying out a too conciliatory foreign policy, accuse him of refusing to intervene in Syria because he's trying to keep Russia happy. That's essentially what an argument in foreign policy is being made today. They say it was ridiculous to ever think that a diplomatic solution could be reached to this crisis via Russia. Of course, the hope was that Russia might use its leverage with Syria to persuade Assad to go. They say that was never going to work. To start with, they've got a long friendship, the Russian regime, with the Assad family, dating back decades. Then Russia doesn't particularly want to encourage sectarian dissidents among, for example, Muslim rebels in Chechnya and other parts of the Caucasus. So really, this solution was never going to work, and the US foreign policy says has been using it as an excuse to avoid intervening in a more military, more serious way in Syria, to avoid facing up to its responsibility, really, they say. Meanwhile, the conflict continues to widen, of course, across the region. The Washington Post, their correspondent in Lebanon today, says that all the different political factions there seem to be gearing up and preparing themselves for the civil war extending itself once again into Lebanon, where, of course, it lasted for 16 years. They say all the political actors there say they, of course, hope there is no conflict in Lebanon, but at the same time, they're all arming their partisans and local militias.
And what are the papers saying about the crucial rulings we're expecting in Egypt this Thursday?
Well, it's a complex argument, really, between the principle of whether or not Ahmed Shafiq, the former Prime Minister of Mubarak, should be disqualified on those grounds, and between those who say that even if maybe in theory he should have been, it's just too late now and the election should be allowed to run as it is. There's an article in Al-Aram which says essentially that while maybe he should have been disqualified to start with, it's a bit late now, it's just got to go ahead. And it is, of course, though, giving fuel to those on the revolutionary side of the movement who've been opposed to him for a long time. They do point out, though, in that article that he does have quite a solid support base among Coptic Christians, particularly, who are afraid of Islamism, and among a big swathe of Egyptian society who are just afraid of crime and see him as representing stability and law and order.
Elections coming up in Greece too this weekend, where the situation might perhaps not be quite as bleak as we've been hearing.
Well, we have heard obviously lots of dreadful things coming out of Greece recently, but there's an interesting article in The Guardian which profiles a number of young people who studied or worked abroad and have now decided to move back to Greece. Lots of them are young entrepreneurs, people starting up new firms, which is exactly the opposite from what you might think you'd do if you were Greek now. The last thing you would do is move home, but they have found a bunch of young people who might just represent Greece's future. They've come back because they believe that their country does have a future and they want to play a part in rebuilding it.
And finally, Lenin might finally be laid to rest.
Yes, this is also according to The Guardian. They say that local authorities in Moscow think it might be the time to finally bury him. Of course, he's embalmed and you can go and visit him in a mausoleum in Red Square. And you were just saying we've both been, and he does look quite waxy, I certainly thought, and not like he might ever have been a real person. But of course, it is apparently Lenin's real body. And now they want to finally lay him to rest nearly a century after he died in 1924. This is quite controversial, though, among those Russians who still have a certain amount of nostalgia for the communist regime. When it originally fell in 1989, it was suggested he should be buried then, but that apparently caused demonstrations and protests by people angry that but the new government was seeking to get rid of the country's communist legacy. So we'll see if they manage to bury him now.
All right, well, keep us posted, Elena. Thank you very much for that.